For this week's video, I'd like to go through another layout design project. This one is for a customer who lives in eastern Tennessee. Here is the plan of part of his basement drawn to scale. The center section, this area that's approximately a square here, is available for his railroad. And he also has one wall of his workshop that we figured we could put a 20-foot by 3-foot staging yard in there. Overall, the boundaries of the railroad are a little bit more than 20 feet square. Originally, he said that we needed to keep a 3-foot aisle along the south wall and past the bathroom. But after a little discussion on that, we decided to give the family a little bit more space. So we went with 42 inches here and 48 inches around the end of the bathroom. We figured that giving back those extra few inches is well worth it for family peace. Now, normally it comes out as far as the doors through here, but he did say we could go about 8 inches further. I don't know whether that was an arbitrary number, but I just said thank you very much, I'll take that extra 8 inches. Now, in common with most layout designs, the customer wanted a little bit more than would probably fit comfortably in the room, but in this case it wasn't excessive. This customer wanted to represent the Southern Railroad running through Oneida, Tennessee, south as far as the town of Sunbright, and he wanted to represent the Tennessee Railroad and the Brimstone Railroad, which are both coal hauling short lines which diverge in or near Oneida. Now, it's probably a tall order for a 20-foot square, but he had already mentioned the possibility of putting the Brimstone Railroad on an upper deck. So actually, I was able to fit most of what he wanted quite comfortably into the space. Let's take a look at how I did that. Here is the earliest rough drawing, showing how I decided to use the straight run along the south for Oneida Yard, because that's the longest straight that I was able to get. Come out of staging through Oneida. There's a couple of industries before we get to Helenwood. There's Oneida Wood Yard and a concrete industry. I wasn't able to find any evidence of the concrete industry on the satellite maps, but he did mention that most of the industries that he wants to represent have since closed. Through Helenwood, where there was some storage track and it was used as the interchange for the Brimstone line. I called it Brimstone Junction, I wasn't sure what it was supposed to be called. Turns out it's called New River Junction. It no longer exists. I elected to use this substantial area here for the New River bridges, because that was a signature scene that he wanted to represent. Now, on the prototype, the two bridges are not side by side like this. The Brimstone crosses the river a few miles away, but we didn't have that option of separating the scenes here. Now, because the Brimstone line is much closer to river level, instead of having it climb up to an upper deck, I elected to have it go down to a lower deck, while the main line climbs up to the summit at Robbins, where there used to be a brick plant. Currently, the only industry in that vicinity is a pulpwood spur. And then there was room for one more town here, although he would have liked Elgin, Glen Mary and Sunbright as 3 separate towns. There just wasn't space for it. So I just combined the features that he wanted from all 3 towns. Originally, I was trying to get 3-foot aisles and a 3-foot minimum radius on the main line. It didn't quite fit. I found I had to cut the minimum radius to 33 inches, but that's a figure that he was still happy with. And I was able to keep 3-foot aisles throughout. So that's the basic general arrangement of how I fitted the railroad into the room. Now let's start adding the details. On this drawing, we can see that I've started to add track arrangements. I started with Oneida Yard, since that is the centre of operations here. And although most of the surrounding industries are now gone, and there's no indication of how they were connected, the yard is basically the same shape as it still is on the prototype. There is one extra track running through the town that doesn't have any connections to these, what are probably disused tracks where the depot used to be. And there is actually a Y where the Tennessee Railroad branches off. This overpass is beyond the Y, but I had to move it into town because it was the best way of hiding where the track disappears into staging. And in the confines of the space we had, there was no way that we were going to be able to get the Y in. The track arrangement here, although greatly twisted, is more or less right. And there is still a large industry here, although it's no longer rail served, hard co-flooring. In this area, there's some wasteland where it looks as though some other substantial structures have been demolished. So I'm guessing they were other industries during the period that he's modelling. And since he said he wanted to reinstate some of the industries that had disappeared before his time, I'm figuring this is a good place for another rail-served industry. There is a 4-lane road overpass, and it is a curved flyover over a track that curves in the same direction. So I thought I'd keep the same arrangement, even though I've moved it several miles closer to the yard than it should be. I put in the spurs for his 2 industries that he asked for, and then as we head into Helenwood, there's another industry here which actually is still rail served, called Twin K Construction. The satellite photograph shows quite a long spur branching away from the main line. There are 2 substantial buildings there and quite a large yard full of heavy equipment. Helenwood currently is down to 3 tracks, although I'm told it was more at one point. There's currently a pulpwood spur here, and we talked about moving the concrete industry from its regular location here into Helenwood, where there'd be more space for it. We curve around into New River Junction, where the Brimstone departs. This crossover here should be the other side of the junction, but if I'd put it in here, the run round really wouldn't have been long enough to be useful, so I had to move it. And the Brimstone engine house was further down, but this is where it fits best. I didn't want to deface the New River Bridges scene with the engine house. Now I'm told there was a tunnel here between the bridge and the town of Robbins. I couldn't find it on the satellite photograph, so I'm guessing it's probably been daylighted. I didn't put it in. I moved it to the other side of Robbins because I was going to need some high ground here to hide an access space for access to the staging yard turnouts, and also it helped disguise how close these 2 towns are. Right before Glen Mary, the track crosses over Scott Highway and Black Wolf Creek on the same bridge. They run side by side at an acute angle under the railroad. And then the town of Sunbright should have been on the other side of the main line, but I had to move it inside the curve because that's the only place it would fit. He's happy with the compromise, and we've still got the 2 industries in town that he wanted. Now the track arrangements here are still very basic. This was sketched out just to see if the desired track arrangements would actually fit. And actually they fitted very comfortably, something which doesn't always happen in a layout design. Now also in this version, I started fleshing out the staging yard. I figured that there would be a few long tracks around the front for through freights, another yard inside that, access through the second main for local trains, and then a completely separate yard for the Tennessee Railroad short line. And in 3 feet wide, using 2¼ inch spacing, there is room for 15 tracks. So at the moment, it's nominally 3 5-track yards, although this arrangement will be greatly refined in future renditions of the plan. Here we see the details of the plan starting to take shape. All the tracks are now properly connected up instead of just being thrown together with intersecting lines. The towns of Glen Mary and Robbins haven't changed at all. New River Junction has been refined somewhat. Helenwood has been twisted a little bit and made sure that all the connections work. And I figured out how the Walters Valley cement industry can fit the space. Up here is the intended footprint of the industry, and as we can see, can still be built as per the instructions and just connected up backwards with the conveyor coming out of the other side of this structure here. He will probably do a lot more in the way of kit bashing on this industry, For one thing, there is no way that the back walls of any of these buildings can be seen, so that gives him the opportunity to open them out a bit and incorporate the back wall into the front of the structure to make all the buildings a little bit larger and more believable. Because one of the problems with most structure kits available, they represent buildings that are actually too small to justify being served by rail. So whenever you have the opportunity to do so, it's best to kit bash them into larger structures. The biggest advance in this drawing here is the staging yard that I've actually drawn in detail. I did some track allocation and I came up with 4 long tracks at the front for through trains, which will probably be a coal drag and a mixed freight in each direction. The 5th track in is intended to keep clear as a thoroughfare so that the yard can remain fluid even when full. He will probably use this as an active fiddle yard during operating sessions, and it allows for display running between sessions with all the trains parked in here. Track 6 is intended for his steam excursion passenger train, which he's going to run occasionally, and that's the reason there's a turntable in the corner here to allow him to turn the power and run the train back again. Then the next 4 tracks will be for mainline local trains, and then I figured 2 tracks for local coal traffic and then 3 tracks for the Tennessee Short Line, although those last 5 tracks are interchangeable. I did later reorganize this ladder at this end to improve the alignment, and several of the tracks also got longer in the process, so that was a benefit. And then these 2 tracks that curve around over the staging yard are the Robbins brick plant, which we're just going to have printed on the backdrop. This allows him to switch fairly long blocks of cars here without it taking up too much layout space. Let's have a look at the lower deck. Here we see the lower deck with the Brimstone going into a single turn helix under the staging yard, although this was eventually increased to a 3-turn helix to lessen the grade. Then we have Ritter lumber in this corner here. There was a short passing siding on the Brimstone with a couple of truck dumps. I've copied that arrangement fairly closely, although Ritter lumber should have been further away. And then there were 2 tipples, Sterling tipple and Brimstone tipple. And at the very end of the track there was another truck dump. So the arrangement of the branch line has been followed fairly closely. So now that all the track locations are finalised and many of the important structures have been roughed in, it's time to start getting the scenery features drawn in as close to the prototype arrangement as feasible, while still making sure that it is visually interesting. Well, here is the main deck of the railroad in its final glory. If you compare with the previous version, you can see how I've rearranged the staging yard ladder. A few of the tracks gained significant length by doing that. The 4 long tracks at the front for through trains are in the 18 to 21 foot range, so suitable for up to about 30 cars with 3 or 4 locomotives. Plenty long enough to look great on such a layout. The other tracks for local trains are shorter, mostly in the 12 to 15 foot range, so local freights of around 20 cars with 2 units will still look great. Let's now zoom in and go through each section individually. One of the last changes that I made was to hook up this maintenance track at the other end in the staging yard. So now a short work train can be staged on this track here without tying up a staging track. This little detached spur here represents a track which is still visible on the satellite photographs in approximately this location, although there's no indication of what it's used for. I've finished it as a non-functional rip track. It's a good opportunity to feature a car under the crane lifted up with its trucks being replaced, just as a stationary vignette. I'm not sure what this industry is here. It might actually be part of Hartco, or it might be something completely different. I just know it showed a lot of interesting rooftop details and storage tanks, and there is a spur still here in approximately this location. So it's a good opportunity for an industry of some description. The big industry in Oneida is Hartco Flooring, which is going to be kit bashed from a whole load of Walther's modulars. He has the dairy kit and a few others which he's going to use there. I mentioned earlier that in this location it looks as though some major buildings have been demolished recently. So that is the premise for putting these industrial spurs in. And although there is no longer any sign of engine facilities here, I put a single engine service track in because it's going to be used as the centre of operations. He's probably going to want a full-time switch crew here, and it's also going to originate a couple of local turns. The track on the aisle side is very similar to what is still existing on the prototype, although it doesn't look to be still used. There should actually be 2 tracks here. Rather than squeeze in 2, I just figured there's plenty of room for 1, with just the platform for the freight depot here, the building being off stage, and a fairly long team track with a end loader at the end. In this location on the prototype there are several industries that are not rail served, so I've put one of them in. Pine Creek does actually follow approximately this alignment, diving under the highway overpass. And about halfway between Oneida and Helenwood there is a road paralleling the railroad with residential homes backing onto the railroad, so I've included that here. He has the Walters Farmers Co-op, which is a square wooden grain elevator. He wanted it in this location, not rail served. I've shown it here in 2 places. It's up to him which side of the overpass he puts it. But I drew it in front of the track deliberately to give the train something to disappear behind momentarily, because it breaks up the scene more, it adds effective length and gives a lot of interest. There are several overpasses in this area. I selected Airport Road. It's just the one that jumped out at me. It could have been any of 3 or 4 different ones. Twin K is a real industry, still rail served even today. The satellite photographs show a much longer spur than I've been able to fit in here, curving sharply away from the main line. I wasn't able to reproduce that, but it does follow the prototype arrangement of an open yard full of heavy equipment. It passes one very large single-story structure with a loading dock, and then some storage tanks, then another open area, and it stops short of the second large single-story structure. So although compressed and twisted somewhat, this area does follow the prototype fairly closely. The Helenwood storage tracks, I'm figuring that the first 2 tracks nearest the main line would be for the Brimstone interchange. These front 2 tracks would be used by the local turn switching these industries here. And as I mentioned earlier, the Valley Cement plant will probably be kit bashed to make the structures visibly larger. There's plenty of room to do that here. And there is still a pulpwood loading spur in this location, although actually it's a double-ended track. There wasn't room for it here. You'll probably noticed that a lot of my trees are drawn in with yellow and orange. That's because he asked for early fall, so I've shown that. In the New River Junction area, the line does actually make the same reverse curve as I've been able to fit in here. It was just purely by chance with this location on the layout that the alignment was fairly close. Highway 27 passes under the railroad here, and as I mentioned earlier, the engine house should be further away. But since the grade for the Brimstone Railroad starts right after the turnout here and heads down, the engine house will end up about ½ an inch lower than the rest of the track in this area. So that will help to disassociate it visually. Moving on now to the bridge scene. The satellite photographs show a very substantial bridge on the Southern Railway here. There are 3 very large truss spans in the centre, with 3 shorter plate girder spans on each end. And then the New River appears to be very shallow at this point with a lot of sandbanks, and it does actually make this graceful S-curve, although it goes the other way on the prototype. If you recall from the earlier drawing, the low level starts right about here, so I didn't want to curve the river the other way and have it interfering with the lower level scene, so that's why I curved it this way instead, where there was plenty of room for it. And although these two bridges should not be visible side by side, the Brimstone line is on a much lower level at this point, and it's pretty much hidden in the trees, so unless there's a train on it, it's not going to draw attention to itself. And both bridges can be, although slightly reduced, very good renditions of the prototype. So as I mentioned, in the Robbins area, there is still a pulpwood loading spur. I've drawn the depot as an abandoned, overgrown one. And then we've got two tracks heading off through the backdrop to a brick plant, which is just printed on the backdrop instead of modelled. So there is plenty of space here for an access opening, partially under the high-level scenery at the back of this scene. It's around 18 inches wide, which is plenty for occasional maintenance. Although originally the plan was to fill in this door opening, it turns out that it's much better to just get rid of the door and leave the opening full size. The frame will have to be hacked into here, but otherwise everything fits just the way it is. This bridge here with Black Wolf Creek and Scott Highway, they do actually pass under the railroad at an angle, but it should be the other way. I did it this way because it fitted better and gave me a reasonable length of the road and creek visible. There is actually a fairly sharp curve in the road just after it crosses under the bridge. And it should actually be a double track bridge, but the customer wanted mostly single track. There's a third pulpwood loading spur at Elgin. Remember I said this is bits of Elgin, Glen Mary and Sunbright all mixed together. And then the grade will start at about here opposite the pallet factory and head back down around the curve towards the staging yard. In order to make the best use of this area at the end of the peninsula, I brought the backdrop forward, curved it round, and this angled benchwork here is just far enough out that you can't see the edge of it from any possible viewing angle, making it appear that the scenery goes on forever. And then it just disappears from view, heads back to staging. And it will be behind the low-level backdrop, so there'll need to be a piece of removable scenery here, because otherwise we've got about 8 feet of track which wouldn't otherwise be accessible too easily. So that's the top deck done. Heading back to the Brimstone Bridge, let's now go from there to the lower level. You see it disappears into a dense wooded area, because a tunnel on a short line like that would be very difficult to justify, and of course there wasn't one. So select low level. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, we ended up with a 3-lap helix underneath the staging yard. That gives us about 24 inches railhead to railhead from one deck to the other. Ritter lumber, I got 3 tracks. I'm not sure whether they ever received logs by rail, but there still could be a log pond, and this track here allows for it if he wants to do it that way. And then this middle track will be for shipping finished lumber, and then the back track will be for shipping wood chips. 2 truck dumps at the Pemberton siding. Now for most of its distance, the Brimstone Railroad followed Brimstone Creek. So I have a bridge here winding around the back, cross back under the railroad on a different kind of bridge, have the 2 tipples further down, and then following the creek again, the truck dump right at the end of track, as on the prototype. So that's about it for this railroad. There has been talk of the customer having me build it, or part of it anyway. I don't know whether that's going to happen yet. It's going to depend largely on whether he likes my bid or not, or whether he can handle it himself. It's certainly not an easy railroad to build. The bench work is particularly complex. Track work should be fairly basic. It's all standard Walthers turnouts, although a few of the curved turnouts did need to be trimmed to get them to fit. There are 105 turnouts on the entire layout. I haven't measured the track. Let's do that now. Compute track length. Okay, on that level it's about 100 feet. And on the main deck, allowing for the helix. There's about 800 feet of track on the layout. So I'm just going to sign off here. I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it informative, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.